When women were first allowed to participate in the Summer Olympics at the start of the 20th century, many held the hope that this would pave the way to equality by showing the world the full extent of women's athletic ability. However, in the 120 years that have followed, this has not been the case. Not only are women's sports, including the Olympics, treated like an afterthought, but organisations such as the International Olympic Committee, or IOC, have spent decades attempting to police femininity, using their authority to punish women who transgress Western patriarchal norms. This violence has only gotten worse with the growing visibility of trans people, with policies that target them impacting all women. The rulings of the IOC, as well as the World Athletics Group, or WA, formerly known as the International Association of Athletics Federations, have had a scarring impact not just upon sports, but society as a whole. Not only are they seen as the golden standard, influencing how sporting leagues around the world handle the matter of gender in sport, but they also influence the public perception of the issue, being the reason so many people believe there even is one to begin with. So, how did we go from what, on paper, seemed an almost utopian project designed to show off the very best womanhood has to offer, to a situation where women are being punished and rejected for being exceptional? How does the current surge in transmisia intersect with intermisia, homomisia, and racism? And how can we try to improve the situation? These are some of the questions I want to answer throughout this series, starting with the early history of women's sports, the emergence of trans participation, and the precursors to the modern anti-trans panic. Though before we do, I just need to give a quick content warning for the following: transmisia, intermisia, misogyny, racism, Nazi fascism, torture, sexual violence, gatekeeping, and outing. If you like our work and appreciate the research put into each video, please consider supporting the channel via Patreon. You can also support us by liking, commenting, and sharing our work on social media.
Women's sports are under attack.
Trans teens sues Governor DeSantis for protecting women's sports.
Does allowing transgender women to compete spell the end to women's sports?
Abuse of women in sports under the guise of trans rights deserves a Me Too moment.
The transgender threat to women's sports.
And I'm convinced that unless quickly rectified, this will kill women's sport.
It's fair to say that trans athletes, specifically trans women, have been dragged through hell the past decade. Indeed, since the trans tipping point of 2014, brought about by the notoriety of trans icons such as Laverne Cox, trans people have entered a period of public scrutiny like never before. Yes, society had, for a long time, perceived us as deviant, but we were also perceived as incredibly rare, existing solely within the realm of urban legend and gossip mags. Now, we were everywhere, in your schools, your bathrooms, and yes, even your sports. And whilst we'd always been there, society just refused to acknowledge our existence in the vast majority of cases, reactionary forces have sought to use this discovery as a means of furthering their own violent agenda. From 2014 to 2018, the political discussion regarding trans people was dominated by narratives regarding the apparent danger trans women pose to cis women and young girls in public bathrooms. And while such rhetoric hasn't vanished, it never does, there was an undeniable shift in focus towards trans participation in sports as we neared the end of 2018, with the far right pretending to care about fairness in order to further their own bigoted agenda. In order to help them achieve this, they've come to rely on a number of unfounded assumptions made by generations past, specifically those in relation to gender, testosterone, and their impact on athletic ability. So to truly understand the mess we are currently in, we have to go back all the way to the very beginning of the modern Olympics. Whilst women were participating by the time of the second modern Olympics in Paris in 1900, they numbered only 22 athletes out of a total of 997, less than 3% of total competitors. They were also limited to 5 events: tennis, sailing, croquet, equestrianism, and golf, though said sports were mixed gender. And that's largely how things remained at the Olympics for the next 2 decades, as society began to wrestle with the question as to what to do with female athletes. Now, there were a few reasons for this, though most of them can be boiled down to a singular source: the notion that women competing in sports is emasculating to men. This is why, when Mad Sires entered the 1902 World Figure Skating Championships and came second place, the International Skating Union, or ISU, voted 6-3 to ban women from the event. The fact that a woman had even come close to taking the gold terrified men at the time, who had built society on the misogynist premise that men were simply better than women, particularly when it came to athletic prowess. This is actually a concept referred to as musculinity, that is, a sense of masculinity which is tethered to one's physical prowess, particularly when juxtaposed to the perceived frailty of women. And whilst the ISU ultimately relented in 1905, setting up a women's division the following year, some people still weren't happy with the decision. One such person was Baron Pierre de Coubertin, founder of the modern Olympic Games, who, when asked about the possibility of a women's division at the 1912 Summer Olympics in Stockholm, simply declared, quote, "A female Olympics would be inconvenient, uninteresting, unaesthetic, and not correct. The true Olympic hero is, in my opinion, the individual male adult. The Olympic Games have to be restricted to men. The role of women should first be to crown the winners." End quote. As we can see, many men simply felt threatened by women competing, even in their own categories. So much so that, rather than allowing women to compete fairly to put their wild hypotheses about female capability to the test, they began asserting that any athletic display by women was destined to fail to match up, much less surpass, that of any man. That it be nothing more than a sad mockery, something to scoff at. At least we know better these days, hey? Though it wasn't just public figures who rejected the proposal. It was also doctors utilising scientific misogyny, the pseudoscientific belief that empirical evidence existed to support or justify gender inequality and patriarchy. For you see, French doctors not only declared women to be inferior to men in every way relating to sport, but argued that regular sports participation in women damaged their reproductive organs. Because that's just how things work. That's biology. That's biological fact. No, we don't need proof of what we're saying. It's just common sense. What's more is, reproduction was kind of a big deal at the time. The First World War came and went, leading to a lot of pressure being placed on women to replace the 20 million lives lost, an unprecedented number at the time. So not only was female sport seen as a threat to male athletes, it was also seen as wholly unpatriotic. In spite of this, pressure continued to mount, with people such as Alice Josephine Marie Milliat demanding that the International Olympic Committee organise women's competitions for the Antwerp Games in 1920. Sadly, just as before, said demands were ignored. Undeterred, Alice founded the Fédération Sportive Féminine Internationale, or FSFI, in 1921, and began hosting women's events in parallel to the main Olympics, building on the early success she'd had in running a few smaller events during the Antwerp Games the year before. Alice's efforts paid off, and by 1928, the Olympics opened 5 sports categories specifically for women. Though the parallel events would still be maintained by the FSFI over the years, growing in scope and continuing to pressure the IOC to add more and more official events for women. However, it's here that we began to see the first signs of sporting leagues, such as the IOC, policing the femininity of its participants. One clear example of this was the introduction and later removal of the 800-meter race during the 1930s, with the reason given for its removal being that the women who competed were quote-unquote not sweet. That is, they show signs of exertion, namely sweating and breathlessness, things that offended the sensitivities of the male spectators, as well as concerned the doctors who hadn't yet abandoned their beliefs regarding the apparent ravages of sports on the cis-female reproductive system. Yet, this challenge to the idea of what was feminine and what was masculine was nothing compared to what was about to happen. Numerous high-profile cases began to emerge during the 30s, cases that drew into question the very way society thinks of sex and gender. Cases like that of Zdeněk Koubek. Zdeněk Koubek was an intersex Czechoslovakian born in 1913, that is to say, someone born with differences in sexual development. Yet, in spite of knowing this at birth, Zdenek's parents and doctor ultimately assigned him as female at birth. And whilst he grew up to have an extraordinary sporting career, winning 5 national titles in 1934, setting multiple world records, he was ultimately unhappy. For you see, as well as being intersex, Zdeněk was a trans man. That's why in 1935, Zdeněk retired, handed back all his medals, and proceeded to demand that the state recognize him as a man. This would then lead him to medically transition in 1936, finally becoming who he felt he was always meant to be. And far from harming his reputation, doing so turned Zdeněk into a star. He'd go on to do multiple tours across both Europe and the US to talk about his experience as a trans intersex athlete, meeting famous actors and even performing in stage shows. In the same vein as Christian Jorgensen 20 years later, some of you might recognize her as the ex-GI turned blonde beauty, Zdeněk wasn't met with the outright hostility we've come to expect from the papers today. In fact, many saw him as a modern wonder, a sign of how much society was advancing both scientifically and socially. And this was something he was happy to lean into. Even Zdenek's family, who, keep in mind, were devout Catholics, were more than happy to allow the papers access to their lives in a rather intimate manner, especially considering the period, all as a means of celebrating their son for who he was. That's one of the reasons we have so many photos of not just him, but him and his family. Zdeněk would eventually stop touring before moving back to Prague after the Second World War, where he subsequently settled down and married his wife, passing away in 1986 at the age of 72. And whilst Zdeněk never returned to professional sports following his transition, he did join the local rugby team along with his brother and was completely accepted as one of the guys. Sadly, not everything was perfect. Whilst most of the coverage of Zdeněk was positive, a number of papers began to use his story to whip up fears about cis men potentially infiltrating women's sports. This is propaganda that sadly continues to this day, with notable anti-trans bigot Linda Blade, author of Unsporting: How Trans Activism and Science Denial Are Destroying Sport, listing Zdeněk as a cis man who apparently lied in order to infiltrate women's sports. It really goes a long way to show the quality, or more accurately lack thereof, of her and her peers' work. Looking back at what has happened the last half a decade, it's hard not to see history repeating itself. Mac Beggs is a trans man and former American high school wrestler who wanted to compete in the boys' league and yet was forced to compete in the girls' league. This allowed predatory trans misses to take photos of him from events and present him as a cis boy claiming to be a trans girl in an attempt to demonize both trans boy athletes and all trans women. All because a trans boy was forced to compete with cis girls in wrestling. History really is a circle. Returning to the 30s, however, Zdeněk Koubek was not alone. Around the same time, over in the UK, Mark Weston, another trans man, was making waves with his own transition. Just like Koubek, Mark was intersex and had been assigned female at birth. Mark also had an incredibly successful sporting career, quickly becoming known as one of the best field contestants in the UK, earning him the nickname the Devonshire Wonder. However, Mark quickly realised that he wasn't a woman, that he was in fact a man. So in 1936, Mark retired in order to undergo a series of gender-confirming surgeries at Charing Cross Hospital before officially changing his name to Mark. He then settled into his new life as a monsieur before marrying Alberta Matilda Bray, with whom he would go on to have 3 children. All of which drew not just national, but international attention. Not all of it good. Thankfully, Mark could at least count on the support of his local community, telling an American paper that, quote, "I was born and reared in Orriston. I think without undue vanity, I show pluck by continuing to live here, where everybody knows my story. But my old neighbours are very kind and want the rest of the world to let me alone." End quote. Mark and Alberta would later move to the US for a while before moving back, with Mark passing away at Freedom Fields Hospital in 1978 at the age of 72. However, during Mark's fame, Pandora's box had been opened. There was not one, but 2 openly trans athletes, and whilst neither of them had competed post-transition, people began asking questions about how the separation of men's and women's categories stood in regards to the existence of both trans and intersex people. The Daily Sketch, a British tabloid from the time, ran the headline, "Women Who Change Sex, Problem for Sports Organisations," stating that, quote, "Women's sporting organisations are taking steps to deal with the problem of the man-woman athlete. The subject will be raised jointly by England and Czechoslovakia, each of whom had a case of a woman athlete being changed by surgical operation into a man." End quote. Meanwhile, the American-based Time magazine ran an article discussing both Mark and Zdeněk, stating that Zdeněk was, quote, "one of 2 cases which worry-ridden Avery Brundage, chaperone of the US Olympic athletes in Berlin, had in mind when he demanded examination for sex ambiguities in all women competitors." End quote. Tensions were clearly rising, and they'd only get worse with the approaching Olympic Games. There would, in fact, be multiple accusations of women actually being cis men or intersex at the 1936 Berlin Olympics, with the most famous being Helen Stevens, an American sprinter who won the gold in both the 100-metre and relay, and was subsequently accused of being a man by a Polish journalist. The whole thing was an international scandal. An American athlete being accused of having lied about her gender? But what was the US to do? After all, Avery Brundage, the US chaperone at the time, had called for all athletes to be tested in the lead-up to the game. I just want to stop here and highlight how dehumanizing sex testing is as a process. It is fundamentally a form of sexual violence, no matter which type of testing is being conducted. Said tests are carried out at the very height of coercion, with an individual's reputation, career, and even sexual identity being held ransom. The very act of validating or invalidating a person's sexual identity on the basis of a test is also highly likely to cause both mental and social harm, irrespective of the results, and thus constitutes sexual violence. Furthermore, if an individual is trans or intersex, sex testing also acts as a form of institutional outing, which is another distinct form of sexual violence. People have the right to privacy, identity, and protection from cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, all of which are violated by so-called sex testing. And I am not alone in reaching such a conclusion. As noted by Human Rights Watch in their 2020 report, the process of sex testing is so brutal that, after decades of protest by women's rights groups and medical organizations, World Athletics was forced to drop mandatory sex testing in 1992, with the IOC following suit in time for the 2000 Sydney Olympics. This debate has long been settled. The only reason we're even talking about this is because, rather atrociously, the WA and IOC retained the privilege to force specific individuals to take those very same tests on an ad hoc basis, a fact that was largely tolerated due to who was being targeted, namely East European and non-white women. It is wrong today, it was still wrong back then. I need to make that absolutely clear. Ultimately, Helen was forced to endure said dehumanizing examination, only to be declared a woman. Yet the rumours persisted, with Look magazine in the US profiling her, running photographs of the athlete alongside the caption, quote, "Is this a man or a woman?" end quote, which fits right in with today's so-called reporting. Suffice to say, Helen sued the magazine for libel, with the case being settled out of court for $5,500 US, which is worth just over $100,000 today. All of which goes to show that the witch hunts had already begun, and cis women were being harmed in the process. Though, in a cosmic yet tragic twist of irony, the Polish woman that had come second place to Helen in the 100-meter dash, Stanisława Walasiewicz, would posthumously be outed as an intersex cis woman after she was tragically murdered during a robbery in 1980. It turned out that not only did she lack a uterus, but that she had a partially extended phallus, meaning that she almost certainly knew that she was intersex. That means she was forced to stand there and watch in silence as one of her countrymen accused the person she lost to of being a man, seeing up close and personal the way she'd likely be treated were anyone to find out that she was intersex. Though Helen and Stanisława weren't the only controversial figures at the 1936 Olympics. Another such person was Heinz Ratjen, a German high jumper who was also an intersex trans man. Heinz was documented as being intersex at birth and has subsequently been assigned female, yet by around the age of 10 or 11, he began to realise that he was, in fact, a boy. Sadly, Heinz never got the chance to change the gender marker on his official documents on his own terms, with the one place able to help him with that, the Institute for Sex Research in Berlin, having been raided by the Nazis in 1933 when he was only 14. Heinz was stuck with his female papers in Nazi Germany at a time where it wasn't safe to be LGBT+, so he kept his gender hidden, at least publicly. Heinz would later begin to compete in sports, coming fourth in the women's high jump at the Berlin Summer Olympics in 1936. Now, a common myth surrounding Heinz's participation is the idea that he replaced his teammate, Gretel Bergmann, a Jewish woman who was excluded as part of the Nazi stance against Jewish participation at the Olympic Games. Indeed, Gretel herself believed this to be the case, and it was the narrative promoted in a 2009 German film, Berlin 36, a dramatized retelling of Gretel Bergmann's exclusion from the 1936 Berlin Olympics. This seems to be an early form of what we see today in how trans women are accused of stealing spaces that belong to cis women. Except in this case, it's twice as bad, with Heinz supposedly stealing his place from a Jewish woman in Nazi Germany. The truth, however, is that the German women's team only put forward 2 athletes for the high jump, one less than the 3 they were allocated, meaning Germany chose to leave a slot open. Heinz didn't replace anybody. Another historical inaccuracy the film promotes is the idea that the Nazis were aware that Heinz was intersex, going so far as to present him as some sort of superweapon. This contradicts known facts, namely how Heinz was discovered by the Nazis during a train journey in 1938. He was subsequently put on trial for fraud, with the Reich being put down as the victim of his so-called deceptions. Now, Heinz was ultimately found not guilty, as there was no evidence that he lied with the intent to benefit, though he was stripped of a gold medal he'd won at the European Championship in 1938 and issued new documents under the name Heinrich. Heinz would spend the rest of his years working at his parents' bar, refusing interviews, up until his death in 2008 at the age of 89. Across the border, another figure that gained international interest was Polish athlete Witold Smętek, who was another intersex trans man. I'm starting to notice a pattern here. Witold was a javelin thrower who first piqued the nation's interest in 1934. However, it was less than a year before speculations about Witold being intersex began to circulate, leading him to finally go and get tested in 1936. Unlike the other intersex people we've covered, Witold's family had no idea he was intersex growing up. However, a quick assessment confirmed that this was indeed the case. Witold would then come out about the results in 1937, announcing that he planned to undergo gender-confirming surgeries before going on to change both his gender marker and name via a district court. Sadly, things weren't as easy for Witold as some of the others on this list, leading him to tell the papers in 1939 that he'd like to detransition back to being a woman. Yet he never did, seemingly settling into his male identity, which he continued to live as, marrying 2 women and raising 3 children, before passing away in 1983 at the age of 72. It's worth mentioning that the details of his life in international papers following the Second World War are scarce, with Witold largely being forgotten by the international community. There were even rumours flying about that he died during the invasion of Poland. The reality, meanwhile, was that he served in the Polish resistance throughout Nazi occupation. Witold not only survived the invasion, but actually got married during the initial defense of Warsaw, knowing that there was a good chance he might die in the fighting. Yet he didn't. He survived and would continue fighting the Nazis in secret for the next 5 years. Witold would even be arrested by the Gestapo at one point, yet was thankfully released due to there being insufficient evidence, at which point he fled Warsaw to rendezvous with his wife whilst the heat died down, only returning after the war had ended. Whilst learning about Witold, a part of me couldn't help but see the irony in how, in 2021, the anti-trans bigots who run the On This Day She account on Twitter attempted to whitewash Violet Morris as a, quote, world-class athlete in many sports, end quote, leaving out the fact that she was a brutal Nazi. Morris quite infamously earned herself the nickname the hyena of the Gestapo due to just how brutal her torture methods were, at least prior to her assassination by the French resistance at the request of British intelligence. Everything, save for how she died, is left out. Like, if you're uncomfortable calling the brutal Nazi a Nazi, Maybe that's your conscience letting you know that you shouldn't be making posts glorifying them. By contrast, Witold Smętek is an anti-fascist in the strictest sense of the term, someone to look up to. If you are intersex or trans, especially if you are a trans man, this is your history. Be proud. Be seen. Though, regardless of how quickly he was forgotten, Witold's overall impact on the discourse surrounding gender in sports remains undeniable. Dr. Claire Tebbutt, historian of gender, sex and sexuality, notes that Witold became part of what was perceived as an emerging pattern. That's to say, in the space of less than a decade, numerous trans men who had previously been thought to be female and had competed as athletes had come forward as men and transitioned. This and the idea of masculinity led some to consider whether sports was having an inappropriate influence on women, masculizing them, making them perceive themselves as men. After all, women who exercised gained muscle mass was deemed a masculine trait, ergo, sports arguably masculinized women, at least physically, so why not mentally? This notion wasn't particularly helped by the way in which papers reported these cases, drawing connections between trans men and sports. Even coverage of trans men who weren't professional athletes, like New Zealand's Peter Alexander, put heavy emphasis on sports with their editing. Just consider the following 1937 interview with Peter, specifically which information they cut to immediately after his introduction.
Meet Peter Alexander. This extraordinary character astounded the world when the announcement was blazoned forth. Mavis Higgins the girl had become Peter Alexander the man. Where were you born, Mr. Alexander?
In a little place called Palmerston North in New Zealand. I was born and educated as a girl, but men's sports have always appealed to me particularly. I'm very fond of golf, very keen on swimming, and tennis, of course. In 1927, I was a schoolgirl champion. But then I decided to give it up after that, as I thought I had a decided advantage over my opponents.
A connection between trans men and sports was being fabricated, leading some to wonder if there was a causal link. Of course, today we understand that trans men, including intersex trans men, had always been present. We also understand that there's a ripple effect in how, as one person comes out, others often follow. Remember, these stories were very public and very often reference one another. We also have to consider the role survivorship bias plays in which stories get reported on. Professional athletes already draw both national and international interest, so a professional athlete transitioning is only likely to increase that. The reason there seemed to be an explosion of trans athletes was because athletes were being reported on in a way that other occupations weren't. Likewise, we have to consider the selection process in how professional sports were considered a male-only domain at the time, something that had been the cultural norm for centuries. This means that, as professional sports was open to women, closeted trans men would have been more likely to jump at the opportunity since they weren't concerned with appearing more masculine. In fact, if anything, I imagine it was an incredibly euphoric experience for many of them. Sadly, people didn't understand these things at the time, which is why fears surrounding women's sports had only grown with the emergence of trans men. They were perceived to be a smaller part of a larger concern, a concern that led to the formation of Britain's National Advisory Council for Physical Training and Education Medical Subcommittee on the Desirability of Athletics for Women and Girls in 1939 to investigate the impact of women's sports. Their goal? To find out, quote, A, whether certain forms of exercise should be discouraged, and B, whether there is a limit in any forms of exercise beyond which it is dangerous for women and girls to go. End quote. Again, this was 1939. There are people alive today who were around when doctors seriously sat down to discuss whether sports were harmful to women. A fact that highlights rather nicely what can be accurately described as the fake benevolence of the anti-trans movement. Because anytime gender divisions in sports come up, it's always presented through this very paternalistic lens, this idea that women's divisions were created to protect women and ensure that they had a fair chance at competing. Yet, when we actually go back and look at the history, that's not what we see. Because whilst yes, there were women fighting to be allowed to compete and gendered categories were the primary way this was established, it's important that we don't lose sight of the fact that said women's categories only existed on the conditions set by cis men. It was cis men who had enforced separate categories out of fear of being outcompeted. It was cis men who policed which sports women were allowed to compete in, and it was cis men who set standards regarding the apparent modesty women must show whilst competing. And this hasn't gone away. Margaret Murdoch was the first woman to win an Olympic medal in shooting, taking home the silver in the free positions at the 1976 Summer Olympics in Montreal. However, what actually happened is that she tied for gold with Lanny Bassam. Now, both her and Lanny were open to having a shootout for the gold spot, which was denied. The same with Lanny's request for 2 gold medals to be issued. Margaret was a woman, and thus, in spite of her skill being equal, was deemed the runner-up by default. In a show of true sportsmanship, Lanny defied the IOC and invited Margaret to step up onto the gold podium at the awards. Sadly, the IOC, seemingly afraid of Margaret winning uncontested at the next games, divided the free positions event into separate gender categories. Then, in 1992, Zhang Shang won the gold for skeet shooting at the Summer Olympics in Barcelona, which, again, was a mixed gender event at the time. So, how did the IOC react? Well, women were banned from shooting at the 1996 Summer Olympics in Alberta, and a women's-only event was created for the 2000 Summer Olympics in Sydney. What's really insulting, however, is the way in which women were set fewer targets for their respective category, meaning that no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't even compare their results to men. They were effectively locked out the moment a single woman challenged male supremacy. So much of our modern sports is built around the goal of keeping women in line. To be told all your life that no matter how hard you train, no matter how hard you try, you will always come second best to every man, has a massive and long-lasting psychological and even physiological impact. This is a fact that World Athletics even admitted to back in 2011, when it ruled that London Marathon allowing cis women to run alongside male pacemakers, quote, makes women artificially faster, end quote. Because women who compete with cis men openly, those who have been fully accommodated by sporting institutions, push themselves harder and do better, threatening foundational myths used to uphold the patriarchy. And trans people are seen to be an extension of that threat, both trans men and trans women. Which is why, in spite of all openly trans athletes prior to the Cold War being trans men, the narrative surrounding trans women or cis men pretending to be women and the apparent danger they pose women's sports had already begun to spread. Not only were papers falsely reporting the case of Zdeněk Koubek, but returning to Heinz Ratjen, the German high jumper who famously refused to do interviews, US papers like The Times would go on to run articles claiming that a bar owner named Herman had told them that he'd been forced to pose as a girl, quote, for the sake of the honour and glory of Nazi Germany, end quote, and that, quote, for 3 years I lived the life of a girl, end quote. And whilst it's important to note that the paper got Heinz's life story and name wrong, it's also important to note that this was published in 1966, during a particularly tense period in history, a period in which the modern trans panic surrounding trans women in sports was set in stone. So be sure to join us next time as we discuss the start of the Cold War, the subsequent Red Scare, and its impact on transmisia in sports. Now, I know I always ask you to share our videos, but I'd really like to stress that with regards to this video and the rest of the videos in this series. It's important to remember these stories, both in honouring our forebears and reminding ourselves how we came to be where we are today. So if you feel the same way and would like to help preserve both trans and intersex history, be sure to share this video on social media. And if you appreciate what we do here and want to help out, please consider becoming one of our wonderful patrons who make our work possible. On that note, we'd just like to thank the following people: Matthew Kovac, Hannah Banghart, Gert Van Vorst, Goddess Alita, Marble Wings, Sosh Daniels, Flynn, Higgs the Seagull, and Ocean on a Teaspoon. And for myself, Udita and Levi, take care now.